The Blackwood farm had been empty for 3 years when 17-year-old Kai emerged from the mountain wilderness, carrying nothing but a worn leather satchel and secrets older than the towering pines. The winter of 2019 was already being called the most brutal in Colorado's recorded history, with temperatures plummeting to -40 and snowdrifts swallowing entire barns. Every rancher in the valley was losing livestock daily. Frozen cattle, starving deer, and countless smaller creatures simply vanishing into the white death that stretched endlessly across the landscape. But Kai wasn't just another runaway seeking shelter. Raised by his Cherokee grandmother in the remote peaks, he possessed knowledge passed down through generations, ancient techniques for reading the land, calling to animals, and bending nature's harsh elements to protect rather than destroy. As word spread that not a single animal had died on the old Blackwood property, neighboring farmers began to whisper about the strange boy who seemed to speak the mountain's language. What was Kai's secret? And could this forgotten wisdom save an entire ecosystem from complete devastation? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The first time Kai saw the farm, snow was falling so heavily he could barely make out the silhouette of the abandoned barn through the white curtain. His boots crunched through knee-deep drifts as he approached the weathered wooden structure, its roof sagging under the weight of accumulated ice. The farmhouse beyond sat dark and hollow, windows like vacant eyes staring across the frozen valley. He dropped his satchel beside the barn door and pressed his palm against the splintered wood. The building hummed with old energy, not the electricity of power lines, but something deeper, something that recognized him. "Grandmother," he whispered to the wind, "I found it." Inside the barn, Kai's breath formed silver clouds as he surveyed the space. Hay bales from years past molded in the corners, and rusty farm equipment gathered dust beneath cobwebs thick as blankets. But the bones of the structure were solid. More importantly, it felt right. From his satchel, he withdrew a collection of smooth river stones, each one carved with symbols that predated any written language the valley had ever known. His grandmother's hands had guided his as he'd learned to etch these marks, her voice steady as she'd shared the old stories about places where the barrier between human and animal worlds grew thin. The Blackwood farm was such a place. He'd known it the moment he'd crested the ridge and felt the pull in his chest, the same sensation he'd experienced as a child when wounded animals would find their way to his grandmother's cabin, seeking healing they couldn't name. Kai arranged the stones in a careful pattern across the barn floor, each placement guided by knowledge that lived in his bones rather than his mind. As the final stones settled into place, the temperature inside the barn shifted. Not warmer exactly, but less hostile. The cold became manageable instead of deadly. That first night, he slept curled against a hay bale, his grandmother's voice echoing in his memory. "The old ways aren't magic, little wolf. They're just forgotten science. Remember that when people call you strange." He woke to the sound of breathing that wasn't his own. A doe stood just inside the barn entrance, her brown eyes reflecting the pale morning light. Behind her, barely visible in the doorway, shapes moved in the shadows. Kai remained perfectly still as more animals filed into the barn, rabbits, squirrels, even a young mountain lion that should have been hibernating in a cave somewhere high above the tree line. They settled around the edges of the barn as if following some unspoken protocol, the predators maintaining respectful distance from the prey animals, but all of them drawn by the same inexplicable force. Kai slowly reached into his satchel and withdrew strips of dried venison, wild berries preserved in bear fat, and seeds gathered from high meadow grasses. He'd been saving these supplies for his own survival, but watching the assembled creatures, he understood his purpose here went beyond mere personal endurance. He distributed the food in small piles throughout the barn, careful to place each offering outside the circle of carved stones. The animals approached cautiously at first, then with growing confidence as they realized he posed no threat. By the third day, word had spread beyond the forest. Rancher Joe Millfield drove his truck up the winding road to the farm, his weathered face creased with suspicion and desperate hope. He'd lost 12 head of cattle in the past week, and his neighbor Bill Hartman had found 3 of his horses frozen solid in their paddock. Joe parked outside the barn and stepped into a scene that defied everything he thought he knew about wildlife behavior. Deer grazed peacefully beside mountain goats, rabbits shared space with foxes, and presiding over it all, a lean teenager with dark hair and knowing eyes, who nodded politely as if hosting unexpected guests for dinner was perfectly normal. "Son," Joe said carefully, "what exactly are you doing up here?" Kai smiled, the expression carrying echoes of his grandmother's patient wisdom. Remembering, he replied simply, "The first visitor arrived 3 days after the storm cleared." Marcus had been splitting wood behind the barn when he noticed the red-tailed hawk perched on the fence post, watching him with an intensity that made his hands pause mid-swing. Hawks weren't unusual in these parts, but this one sat motionless for nearly an hour, its golden eyes never leaving his face. By evening, 2 more had joined it. He tried to dismiss the strange behavior as coincidence, but the next morning brought a family of deer that grazed boldly in the front yard, showing no fear when he stepped onto the porch. A murder of crows gathered in the bare oak tree, their usual raucous calls replaced by an eerie silence. Even the mice in the walls had gone quiet. Marcus had always felt different around animals. As a child, stray cats would follow him home from school, and injured birds would somehow find their way to his bedroom window. His grandmother had called it a gift, whispering stories about their bloodline in hushed tones before his parents would change the subject. After she died, those stories became forbidden territory, locked away with the rest of his family's secrets. Now, standing in the kitchen of this forgotten farm, watching a fox curl up on his doorstep like a house cat, those memories clawed their way to the surface. The temperature had plummeted again overnight, turning his breath to fog even inside the drafty house. He'd managed to get the old wood stove working, but it barely warmed the main room. Every window was frosted thick with ice, transforming the world beyond into abstract shapes and shadows. Yet somehow the animals outside seemed unaffected by the brutal cold. Marcus pulled on his coat and boots, stepping carefully onto the ice-slicked porch. The fox lifted its head but didn't flee. Up close, he could see frost crystals clinging to its rust-colored fur, yet it appeared completely at ease. Around the yard he counted at least a dozen rabbits, 3 deer, and countless birds perched on every available surface. All of them watching him. "What do you want?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. As if responding to his question, the fox stood and padded toward the barn. It paused at the entrance, looking back expectantly. The other animals shifted, a ripple of movement that seemed almost choreographed. Marcus felt a pull in his chest, the same inexplicable urge that had driven him to this place. The barn door protested with a sharp creak as he pushed it open. Pale winter light filtered through gaps in the weathered boards, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny spirits. The fox disappeared into the shadows between abandoned stalls, and Marcus followed. In the far corner, partially hidden beneath a moth-eaten tarp, he found them. Books. Dozens of them, bound in leather so old it had turned nearly black. Some were written in languages he couldn't identify, their pages filled with intricate diagrams and symbols that seemed to shift when he wasn't looking directly at them. Others contained pressed flowers and leaves, along with handwritten notes in faded ink. His hands trembled as he opened the topmost volume. The pages fell open to an illustration of a man surrounded by wolves, his arms raised toward a full moon. Beneath the image, in script so ornate it was barely legible, were the words, "The old covenant between flesh and forest, between blood and bone." Marcus slammed the book shut, his heart hammering against his ribs. He'd seen this image before, in dreams that had plagued him since childhood. Dreams where he ran through endless forests on 4 legs instead of 2, where he could taste the wind and hear conversations carried on frequencies beyond human perception. The fox reappeared at his feet, pressing its warm body against his legs. Around the barn, more animals had gathered, Somehow they'd all squeezed through gaps and openings he couldn't see, creating a living circle around the forgotten library. He opened another book, this one filled with genealogical charts that traced family lines back centuries. Names were connected by intricate branches, and beside many of them were small drawings of animals: ravens, bears, mountain cats, wolves. His finger traced the lines downward until he found what made his blood turn to ice water. His grandmother's name, written in the same faded ink as the rest, and beside it, the unmistakable silhouette of a wolf. The animals pressed closer, their collective warmth creating a pocket of heat in the frozen barn. Marcus could feel something awakening inside him, something that had been sleeping for 27 years. It stirred like a creature uncurling from hibernation, stretching ancient muscles and testing forgotten reflexes. Outside, the wind howled with renewed fury, but inside the barn, surrounded by witnesses both living and written, Marcus finally understood why he'd been drawn to this place. The books weren't just records of the past. They were instructions for what came next. The morning brought news that spread through Millbrook like wildfire. Sarah Chen had been making her usual rounds to check the outlying properties when she discovered something that made her radio back to town with a voice tight with disbelief. "Tom, you need to get out to the Henderson place, now." Within an hour, half the town had gathered at the edge of the old farm's boundaries, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air as they stared at what defied every natural law they thought they understood. The property was alive with movement. Hundreds, maybe thousands of creatures that should have been natural enemies, sharing the same space in perfect harmony. Wolves sat beside deer, hawks perched next to rabbits, bears lounged peacefully while mice scurried between their massive paws. The entire ecosystem of the northern woods had converged on this single plot of land, creating a living tapestry that seemed pulled from some primordial dream. "Jesus Christ," whispered Mayor Patterson, his usual bluster reduced to awed silence. "What in God's name is happening here?" The stranger emerged from the farmhouse as if summoned by their presence. In daylight he appeared younger than Tom had initially thought, perhaps in his late 20s, with dark hair that caught the weak winter sun and eyes that seemed to hold depths Tom couldn't quite fathom. He wore simple clothes, worn jeans, a heavy wool sweater, and boots that had seen better days. Nothing about his appearance suggested anything supernatural, yet the animals responded to his presence like iron filings drawn to a magnet. "Morning!" the young man called out, his voice carrying easily across the snow-covered yard. He walked among the gathered creatures without fear, and they parted before him like water, only to close ranks again behind him. A massive timber wolf followed at his heels like a loyal dog. "What's your name, son?" Tom called back, his hand instinctively resting on his service weapon, though he couldn't say what threat he expected to face. David Thorne." The stranger stopped at the property line, separated from the crowd by only a few feet, but seemingly by an ocean of impossibility. "I apologize for the disturbance. They started arriving yesterday evening. I'm not entirely sure why." Sarah Chen stepped forward, her scientific mind grappling with what she was witnessing. "Mr. Thorne, what you're describing is impossible. Predators and prey don't coexist like this. The stress alone should have triggered mass flight responses." David's gaze found hers, and Sarah felt something shift inside her chest, a recognition she couldn't name. Sometimes what we think we know about nature isn't the whole story. Old Henrik Larsson pushed through the crowd, his weathered face creased with something between fear and wonder. "I've lived in these parts for 83 years, he said, his voice carrying the weight of decades. "My grandfather told stories, old stories from the homeland about people who could speak to the wild things. I thought they were just tales." The crowd murmured uneasily. Some of the younger residents pulled out phones, recording video that would later be dismissed as clever hoaxes when shared online. But those present could feel something in the air itself, an electric tension that made their skin prickle and their hearts race. "This isn't natural," someone called out from the back. "It's wrong." David's expression darkened slightly. What's wrong is a world where we've forgotten what we once knew, where we see ourselves as separate from everything else that lives and breathes. He gestured to the animals around him. They remember. Even after centuries of being taught to fear us, some part of them remembers what we used to be to each other. A red-tailed hawk landed on his outstretched arm, its talons finding purchase on his sleeve without drawing blood. The bird fixed the crowd with one bright eye before releasing a piercing cry that seemed to echo longer than physics should have allowed. "You're scaring people," Tom said, though he wasn't sure if fear was the right word for what he was feeling. It was more like vertigo, the sensation of standing at the edge of a cliff and suddenly realizing the ground beneath your feet wasn't as solid as you'd believed. "I'm not trying to scare anyone." David's voice held a note of sadness. "I'm just existing. This," he gestured to the gathering of animals, "happened without my conscious effort, but I won't pretend it surprises me." Dr. Martinez had arrived and was frantically taking notes, her medical training warring with what her eyes reported. The behavioral modifications we're observing would require neurochemical changes that should be impossible to induce without direct intervention. "Maybe," David said quietly, "the changes aren't in them." As if responding to some unheard signal, a portion of the animals began to disperse, melting back into the forest with an orderliness that defied their wild nature. But many remained, settling into what appeared to be a permanent encampment around the old farmhouse. The crowd began to thin as people returned to town, carrying with them questions that would keep them awake that night and stories that would grow in the telling. The old woman's words haunted Marcus as he trudged back through the deepening snow. Ancient bloodlines, the Thornfield curse. He'd come here seeking solitude, not to inherit some rural superstition wrapped in the desperate hopes of frightened villagers. Yet as he approached the farmhouse, he couldn't shake the image of Eleanor Hartwell's weathered hands trembling around her teacup, or the way her eyes had searched his face, as if looking for something she recognized. The animals were waiting for him. They formed loose clusters across the property. Rabbits huddled near the porch steps. A red fox curled beneath the bare apple tree, several deer standing motionless by the barn. As he walked among them, none fled. A crow landed on his shoulder with casual familiarity, and he felt that strange warmth pulse through his chest again, stronger now. Inside the farmhouse, Marcus built up the fire and tried to focus on mundane tasks. He heated a can of soup, attempted to read by lamplight, organized his few belongings, but the sensation of being watched persisted, and when he glanced out the frost-covered windows, he saw dozens of glowing eyes reflecting the light from within. Sleep came fitfully. In his dreams, he stood in a vast forest where every tree bore his face carved into its bark. A woman's voice called to him from the shadows between the trunks, speaking words in a language he didn't recognize, but somehow understood. When he woke near dawn, his sheets were damp with sweat despite the bitter cold. The morning brought an unexpected visitor. Dr. Sarah Chen arrived in a battered Land Rover, her breath forming white clouds as she climbed out. She was younger than Marcus had expected from Eleanor's description, perhaps 40, with graying hair pulled back and intelligent dark eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She moved carefully through the gathered animals, who parted before her like water. "Remarkable," she murmured, kneeling to examine a rabbit that sat perfectly still as she checked its eyes and ears. No signs of illness or distress. Body temperature normal. They're not behaving like animals in crisis. Marcus invited her inside, grateful for human company that didn't come laden with cryptic warnings. Over coffee, Dr. Chen explained that she'd driven out from the university after Eleanor's call, expecting to find evidence of disease or environmental contamination. "But this isn't pathological behavior," she said, warming her hands around her mug. "It's almost like they're—" She paused, seeming to search for the right words. "Have you ever heard of keystone species? Organisms that have a disproportionate impact on their ecosystem? I'm not a biologist." In Yellowstone, when wolves were reintroduced, everything changed. River patterns shifted because deer moved differently. Vegetation recovered. The presence of one species transformed the entire landscape. She studied his face intently. Sometimes the keystone isn't predator or prey. Sometimes it's something else entirely. Before Marcus could respond, a sound outside made them both look toward the window. The animals were moving, flowing across the yard in coordinated patterns that defied explanation. Birds wheeled overhead in precise formations, while mammals below traced corresponding paths through the snow. "That's impossible," Dr. Chen whispered, pressing her face to the glass. "There's no precedent for interspecies coordination on this scale." Marcus stepped onto the porch, and immediately the patterns shifted, centering around him. He could feel something building in the air, an electric tension like the moment before lightning strikes. The warmth in his chest had become a steady pulse, synchronizing with the rhythm of the animal's movements. "What are you?" Dr. Chen asked from behind him. The question hung between them as the display outside intensified. A massive elk emerged from the tree line, its antlers catching the weak winter sunlight. It approached Marcus directly, stopping just within arm's reach. When Marcus extended his hand, the elk lowered its great head and touched its nose to his palm. The contact sent a jolt through his entire body. For an instant, Marcus saw through different eyes. The forest as the elk knew it, every tree and stream and hidden path mapped in perfect detail. He felt the interconnected web of life that pulsed beneath the winter silence, sensed the delicate balance that held it all together. And he understood that something in that balance was failing. The vision faded, leaving him gasping. Dr. Chen steadied him as he swayed, her scientific skepticism clearly warring with what she'd witnessed. "The stories Eleanor tells," she said quietly, "about your family. I thought they were folklore, genetic memory distorted by time and retelling. But this," she gestured at the animals, still moving in their impossible choreography, "this suggests something much older than folklore." Marcus looked out at the gathering creatures, at the ancient farm that had called him home, at the winter that seemed to deepen with each passing hour. Eleanor's words echoed in his memory, "The land remembers, even when we forget." He was beginning to suspect that forgetting might have been a terrible mistake. The snow had stopped falling sometime during the night, leaving the world wrapped in an eerie silence that seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. Marcus stood at his kitchen window, watching the steam from his coffee mug fog the glass as he counted the animals scattered across his property. What had started as a handful of curious creatures had grown into something that defied explanation. A family of deer had taken residence near the old oak tree, their usual wariness replaced by an almost domesticated calm. Ravens perched along the fence line like sentries, their black eyes fixed on the farmhouse. Even the wild turkeys, normally skittish and quick to flee, wandered freely among the other animals as if they'd all signed some invisible peace treaty. The strangest part wasn't their presence, it was their behavior. They moved with purpose, arranging themselves in loose circles and patterns that reminded Marcus of ancient symbols he'd seen in his grandmother's books. Books he'd dismissed as folklore until now. A sharp knock at his front door broke the morning stillness. Marcus set down his mug and made his way through the sparse furniture, his boots echoing on the bare wooden floors. Through the frosted glass, he could make out a tall figure bundled in winter gear. Dr. Sarah Chen stood on his porch, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. She held a worn leather satchel in her gloved hands, and her dark eyes held the intensity of someone who'd been awake most of the night. "Mr. Holloway?" She extended her hand. "I'm Dr. Chen from the university's Biological Sciences Department. I received some rather interesting calls about unusual animal behavior in this area." Marcus studied her face, noting the mix of scientific curiosity and genuine concern in her expression. "Word travels fast around here. May I come in? I'd like to discuss what you've been experiencing." He stepped aside, gesturing her into the warmth of the farmhouse. As she unwound her scarf, her gaze immediately went to the windows overlooking the property. Her sharp intake of breath was barely audible, but Marcus caught it. "How long has this been going on?" she asked, moving closer to the glass. "Started the day I arrived, about a week ago. Gets more intense every day." Marcus joined her at the window. You're not here to tell me it's perfectly normal, are you? Dr. Chen shook her head slowly, pulling a notebook from her satchel. I've been studying animal behavior for 15 years. This, she gestured toward the gathering outside, this is unprecedented. The species diversity alone should make what we're seeing impossible. Predators and prey coexisting peacefully, migratory birds that should have left months ago, nocturnal animals active during daylight hours. Any theories? She was quiet for a long moment, her pen hovering over the notebook. There are documented cases of animals sensing natural disasters before they occur. Earthquakes, tsunamis, volcanic eruptions. But this feels different, more deliberate. Marcus watched a red-tailed hawk land mere feet from a rabbit, neither showing any sign of the deadly dance they should have been performing. Different how? They're not fleeing from something. They're gathering toward something. Dr. Chen looked directly at him. Toward you. The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Marcus felt that familiar stirring in his chest, the same sensation he'd experienced every morning when he stepped outside and felt the weight of dozens of eyes upon him. That's impossible. Is it? Dr. Chen moved away from the window, studying the sparse interior of the farmhouse. This property has quite a history, you know. I did some research before driving out here. Your great-aunt wasn't just a recluse. She was what some might call a folk healer. People came from 3 counties over seeking her help. Marcus felt his jaw tighten. She was an old woman who grew herbs and told stories. Stories about what? The question caught him off guard. He realized he couldn't actually remember the specifics of his aunt's tales, just the feeling they'd left him with as a child, a sense that the world held more mysteries than most people dared to acknowledge. I was very young when she died, he said finally. Dr. Chen nodded, making notes. I'd like to conduct some observations if you're willing. Set up some basic monitoring equipment, document the animal's patterns. This could be the discovery of a lifetime. Through the window, Marcus watched a magnificent buck approach the gathering, its antlers catching the weak morning light. The other animals shifted to make room, maintaining their mysterious formations. As the buck settled into place, Marcus felt something shift inside his own chest, a recognition, ancient and wordless. Dr. Chen, he said quietly, what if this isn't about animal behavior at all? She looked up from her notebook, eyebrows raised. What if it's about something we've forgotten how to understand? Before she could respond, a low, harmonious sound drifted through the windows. Dozens of different species creating something that could only be called a song. The temperature had dropped another 10 degrees overnight, and Marcus could see his breath crystallizing in the air, even inside the cabin. He'd kept the fire burning through the night, but the ancient chimney seemed to leak more heat than it retained. Outside, the wind howled with a ferocity that made the walls shudder, but the animals remained. Through the frost-etched windows he watched them moving through the snow-laden yard with purpose he couldn't fathom. The deer had formed loose circles around the larger trees, their dark eyes reflecting an intelligence that seemed almost human. Ravens perched on every available surface, fence posts, the barn roof, even the cabin's eaves, their black forms creating stark silhouettes against the white landscape. Marcus pulled his coat tighter and stepped outside, his boots crunching through snow that reached nearly to his knees. The cold bit at his exposed skin, but he pressed forward, drawn by something he couldn't name. As he approached the nearest group of deer, they didn't scatter as they should have. Instead, they turned toward him in unison, their movements synchronized in a way that sent chills down his spine that had nothing to do with the weather. The largest buck, its antlers spanning wider than Marcus could reach, stepped forward. Steam rose from its nostrils as it regarded him with eyes that held depths he'd never seen in any wild creature. For a moment, time seemed suspended between them. Then the buck lowered its massive head in what could only be described as a bow. "What do you want from me?" Marcus whispered, his words forming small clouds in the frigid air. The buck raised its head and turned toward the forest, then looked back at Marcus expectantly. Around them, The other animals, deer, foxes, rabbits, even a family of raccoons that should have been hibernating, all turned in the same direction. The ravens above cawed once in unison, a sound that echoed across the valley like a summons. Marcus felt something stirring deep within his chest, a warmth that spread outward despite the bitter cold. It was the same sensation he'd experienced that first night, when the animals had initially gathered. But now it was stronger, more insistent. His skin began to tingle, and he noticed the snow beneath his feet was melting in a perfect circle around him. The buck stepped closer, its breath mingling with Marcus's in the space between them. Without thinking, Marcus reached out his hand. The moment his fingers touched the animal's forehead, the world exploded into sensation. Images flooded his mind, ancient forests stretching endlessly under starlit skies, great herds moving across pristine meadows, pristine rivers flowing clear and cold through untouched wilderness. But these weren't just pictures, they were memories, inherited across countless generations of creatures who had known a world before human dominance. He saw the land as it had been centuries ago, when the farm where he now stood was part of a vast woodland where spirits walked among the trees. He felt the deep sadness of the animals as their territories shrank, their food sources disappeared, their young struggled to survive in an increasingly hostile world. But beneath the sadness was something else, hope. A belief passed down through instinct and genetic memory that someday someone would come who could hear their voices again, someone who could bridge the growing chasm between the human world and the natural one. The visions shifted, showing him glimpses of the future, or possible futures. He saw the valley green and thriving, with streams running clear and wildlife flourishing. He saw himself standing at the center of it all, his hands glowing with the same warm light that now emanated from his skin. But he also saw darker possibilities, the land barren and lifeless, the last animals fleeing or dying, the silence of a world stripped of its wild soul. When the connection finally broke, Marcus staggered backward, gasping. The buck watched him with patient eyes, as Marcus struggled to process what he'd experienced. Around them, the other animals waited, their collective gaze focused on him with an intensity that was both humbling and terrifying. "I don't understand," Marcus said aloud. "I'm nobody special. I'm just a man who wanted to get away from everything." The buck snorted, a sound that almost seemed like gentle disagreement. It turned again toward the forest, took several steps, then looked back. The message was clear: follow. Marcus hesitated. He could return to the cabin, build up the fire, and pretend none of this was happening. He could wait out the winter and leave in the spring, returning to his old life with nothing more than strange stories to tell. But as he looked into the eyes of the creatures surrounding him, he knew that choice was an illusion. Whatever was happening here, whatever he was becoming, there was no turning back. The warmth in his chest pulsed stronger, and the snow continued to melt around his feet. Somewhere in the distance, he heard the haunting call of wolves, the first he'd heard in these parts for decades. Taking a deep breath that tasted of pine and possibility, Marcus followed the buck into the waiting forest. The blizzard had been raging for 3 days when Sarah finally made her decision. She pulled on her heaviest coat and wound a scarf around her face until only her eyes were visible. The wind outside her cabin howled like something alive and hungry, but she couldn't ignore what she'd seen through her kitchen window that morning. A procession of deer had passed by her property, moving single file through snow that reached their bellies. Behind them came a family of foxes, their red coats stark against the white landscape. Even the usually solitary bobcat that denned near Miller's Creek padded along with the group, showing no interest in the smaller animals around it, all of them heading in the same direction, toward the old Hartwell place where the stranger had taken up residence. Sarah had lived in these mountains for 43 years. She'd never seen anything like it. The snow crunched under her snowshoes as she made her way through the forest, following the beaten path left by countless animals. The storm made visibility nearly impossible, but she knew these woods by heart. Every few hundred yards, she'd catch glimpses of movement in the white curtain around her. shadows of creatures still making their pilgrimage toward whatever waited at the abandoned farm. Her breath formed clouds that froze instantly on her scarf. The cold bit through her layers of clothing, but something drove her forward. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was the same inexplicable pull that seemed to be drawing every living thing in the valley to that one place. When she finally emerged from the tree line, Sarah stopped dead in her tracks. The farmhouse stood exactly as she remembered it, weathered and worn, but the property around it had been transformed into something that defied explanation. Despite the raging storm, the snow here fell differently, gentler, as if the very air had calmed. Animals filled every available space, deer clustered near the barn, rabbits huddled beneath the porch, and overhead, the twisted branches of the old oak tree bent under the weight of dozens of birds that should have long since flown south. But it wasn't just the sheer number of animals that made Sarah's heart race. It was the way they were arranged, the careful positioning that spoke of intelligence and purpose. The larger animals formed protective circles around the smaller ones. Predators and prey sat side by side without tension, as if some ancient truce had been called. At the center of it all, barely visible through the snow, a figure moved among them. Sarah crept closer, using the barn as cover. Through gaps in the weathered siding, she could see him clearly for the first time. The young man she'd glimpsed from a distance was smaller than she'd expected, with dark hair that fell to his shoulders and skin that seemed to hold warmth despite the bitter cold. He moved through the animals with fluid grace, touching some, whispering to others, his lips forming words in a language she didn't recognize. As she watched, he knelt beside a massive grizzly bear that should have been deep in hibernation. The bear's breathing was labored, and Sarah could see a festering wound along its flank, probably from a poacher's bullet. The young man placed both hands on the animal's side and closed his eyes. The air around them began to shimmer. Sarah blinked hard, certain the storm was playing tricks with her vision, but the shimmer intensified. A soft, golden light seemed to emanate from the young man's hands, spreading across the bear's fur like liquid sunlight. The other animals pressed closer, forming a tight circle around the healing, their eyes reflecting that same impossible light. The bear's breathing steadied. The wound along its flank began to close, fur growing back to cover the healed flesh. In minutes, the great animal struggled to its feet, fully restored, and padded away to find a spot to rest among the others. Sarah's knees gave out. She slumped against the barn wall, her mind struggling to process what she'd just witnessed. This wasn't possible. Healing like that belonged in fairy tales, not in the real world of mortgage payments and doctor visits and animals that followed the natural order of things. The young man looked up suddenly, his gaze finding hers through the storm as if he'd known she was there all along. His eyes were the color of deep forest pools, ancient and knowing. He smiled, not with surprise or anger, but with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment. He stood and began walking toward her hiding spot, moving through the snow with steps so light he barely left footprints. The animals parted to create a path for him, then settled back into their peaceful vigil. Sarah wanted to run, but her legs wouldn't obey. She could only watch as he approached, bringing with him that strange warmth and the scent of growing things that had no business existing in the middle of winter. When he reached the barn, he extended one hand toward her, palm up, in a gesture of invitation rather than threat. The morning brought with it an unnatural stillness that set Elena's teeth on edge. She had barely slept, her dreams filled with visions of Marcus standing at the center of a vast circle of creatures, his eyes reflecting something that wasn't quite human anymore. When she finally rose and looked out her kitchen window toward the abandoned farm, her blood ran cold. The entire property was surrounded by wolves. They sat in perfect formation, like sentinels guarding a sacred ground. Their breath created small clouds in the frigid air, but they remained motionless, focused entirely on the farmhouse where Marcus presumably still slept. Elena grabbed her father's old binoculars from the kitchen drawer, her hands trembling as she adjusted the focus. There had to be at least 20 of them, maybe more. Some were partially hidden by the snow-laden pine trees that bordered the property. Their eyes caught the early morning light, glinting like amber beacons in the white landscape. She had lived in these mountains her entire life and had never seen wolves behave this way. A soft knock at her back door made her jump, nearly dropping the binoculars. She crept through the house, peering through the frosted glass panel. A figure stood on her porch, tall and familiar. "Marcus!" She opened the door cautiously, noting how he seemed completely unaffected by the bitter cold, despite wearing only a thin jacket. "How did you—" "The wolves. They won't hurt you," he said simply, stepping inside without invitation. His presence filled her small kitchen with an energy that made the air feel charged, like the moments before a lightning strike. "I need your help." Elena glanced back toward the window. "Those wolves were surrounding your place. How did you get past them?" Marcus followed her gaze, and for a moment something flickered across his features. Uncertainty, perhaps even fear. "They're not surrounding the farm, Elena. They're protecting it. And me." He turned back to her, and she saw that his eyes had changed again. The green now shot through with gold flecks that seemed to move in the light. "Something is coming. Something that wants to stop what I'm trying to do." "And what exactly are you trying to do?" Elena demanded, her patience finally fraying. "The animals, the weather patterns, the way the very air changes when you're around. What are you?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, studying her face as if weighing how much truth she could handle. Finally, he spoke. "My grandmother used to tell me stories about the old ways, before humans forgot their place in the natural order. She said there were those who could serve as bridges between worlds, people who could speak to the earth itself, who could call the wild things home." Elena's rational mind rebelled against his words, but she couldn't deny what she had witnessed. "That's impossible." "Is it?" Marcus moved to her window, gazing out at the wolves. "Look at them. Really look. When was the last time you saw predators and prey coexist like they have been around my farm? When did you last witness such harmony in the wild?" She joined him at the window, and as if summoned by their attention, more animals began to emerge from the forest. Deer stepped delicately through the snow, their usual wariness absent as they grazed peacefully near the wolves. A family of foxes played in a nearby clearing, their red coats vivid against the white ground. High above, eagles and hawks circled in lazy spirals, their territorial instincts seemingly forgotten. "It's like they're waiting for something," Elena whispered. "They are." Marcus's voice carried a weight that seemed to press against her chest. "The earth is dying, Elena, not just from pollution or climate change. Those are symptoms of a deeper wound. Humans have forgotten that we are part of nature, not separate from it. We've broken something fundamental, and the break is spreading." Elena watched a massive brown bear lumber into view, settling down among the other creatures with impossible docility. "And you think you can fix it?" "I think I can remind the world what we've lost." Marcus's hand found hers, and she felt that same electric current she had experienced before, but stronger now. Through the connection, images flashed through her mind. Vast forests stretching unbroken across continents, rivers running crystal clear, skies filled with birds in numbers that darkened the sun. And threading through it all, a presence, ancient, patient, but wounded. "The others of my kind are scattered," Marcus continued. "Most don't even know what they are. But when we gather, when we work together, we can heal the rift. We can call the wild back home." Elena jerked her hand away, the visions fading. "Others? How many others?" "I don't know. But they'll come, just like the animals do. They'll feel the call." Marcus's expression grew grave. "The problem is so will those who want to keep things as they are. There are forces that profit from the separation, from the wound. They've been hunting us for generations." As if summoned by his words, the wolves outside suddenly rose to their feet, their hackles raised. A low, collective growl rumbled across the landscape, and every animal turned to face the same direction, toward the access road that led up from the valley. Something was coming. The snow had stopped falling, but the silence that followed felt heavier than any blizzard. Marcus stood at the edge of what had once been the farm's eastern pasture, watching as hundreds of animals arranged themselves in perfect concentric circles around him. Deer stood shoulder to shoulder with wolves, their ancient enmity seemingly forgotten. Cardinals perched on the antlers of a massive elk, while field mice scurried fearlessly between the paws of a red fox. Dr. Sarah Chen crouched behind a fallen log 50 yards away, her breath forming crystalline clouds as she adjusted her camera lens. She had been documenting this phenomenon for 3 days now, but nothing had prepared her for what she was witnessing. The animals weren't just gathering, they were organizing themselves with an intelligence that defied every principle of wildlife behavior she had studied. "This is impossible," she whispered into her recording device. "The prey species should be in a constant state of panic, yet they appear completely calm. The predators show no hunting instincts whatsoever. It's as if some external force has temporarily suspended the natural order." Marcus raised his hand, and the entire assembly fell silent. Even the wind seemed to pause, waiting. He closed his eyes and felt the familiar warmth spreading through his chest, that strange energy that had been growing stronger since his arrival at the farm. When he opened them again, his vision had changed. He could see threads of golden light connecting every living thing in the clearing, not just the animals but the dormant trees, the frozen earth beneath the snow, even the seeds sleeping deep underground. The revelation struck him like lightning. He wasn't just communicating with the animals, he was seeing the web that connected all life, a network of energy that pulsed beneath the surface of the visible world. And somehow, inexplicably, he had become a conduit for that ancient power. A rustling in the underbrush caught his attention. Sheriff Tom Bradley emerged from the tree line, his hand resting instinctively on his sidearm. Behind him came Father Miguel Santos, the elderly priest from the town's only church, his weathered face creased with concern. "Son," the sheriff called out, his voice carefully controlled, "I need you to step away from the animals." Slowly, Marcus turned toward them, and several of the animals shifted position, creating a protective barrier between him and the approaching men. A black bear rose onto its hind legs, not in aggression but in warning. 3 wolves padded forward, their yellow eyes fixed on the intruders. "They won't hurt you," Marcus said, his voice carrying an otherworldly resonance that made both men stop in their tracks. "They're not here to threaten anyone. They're here because they remember." "Remember what?" Father Santos stepped forward, his religious training overriding his fear. He had seen enough in his 60 years to recognize something beyond the natural world when it presented itself. "The old contract," Marcus replied, though the words seemed to come from somewhere deeper than conscious thought. "Before we forgot how to listen. Before we convinced ourselves that we were separate from everything else that lives and breathes on this earth." Dr. Chen abandoned her hiding place and approached the group, her scientific curiosity overwhelming her caution. "Marcus, I've been monitoring electromagnetic activity in this area. The readings are off the charts. Whatever's happening here, it's generating energy signatures unlike anything in the literature." Marcus nodded slowly. "I can feel it too. It's like the earth itself is waking up after a long sleep." He gestured toward the assembled animals. "They never forgot. They've been waiting for someone to bridge the gap again." "Bridge the gap to what?" Sheriff Bradley demanded, though his hand had moved away from his weapon. The sheer impossibility of the scene before him had shifted his thinking from law enforcement to something closer to awe. "To understanding," Marcus said, "to the way things were meant to be." He looked directly at Dr. Chen. "You study animal behavior, but you study it from the outside, looking in. What if there was another way? What if we could understand, not by observing, but by connecting?" The largest wolf in the pack approached Marcus and sat at his feet. Without hesitation, Marcus placed his hand on the animal's head. For a moment, the golden threads of light became visible to all of them, a vast network of interconnected energy that revealed the farm, the forest, and everything within it as part of a single living organism. Father Santos crossed himself, but his expression held wonder rather than fear. "Dear God," he whispered, It's beautiful." The vision lasted only seconds before fading, but its impact was undeniable. When Marcus looked up at the four adults staring at him in stunned silence, he saw understanding beginning to dawn in their eyes. "This is just the beginning," he said quietly. "What you've seen here today, this is what we've lost. But it's not gone forever. The question is, are we ready to remember who we really are?" The storm that had been building for 3 days finally broke just after midnight. But it wasn't like any winter storm Marcus had ever witnessed. Instead of the usual howling winds and driving snow, an eerie stillness settled over the valley as if the very air had been frozen in place. Through the frosted windows of the farmhouse, he could see the animals gathered in the yard, hundreds of them now, maybe thousands. They stood motionless in the falling snow, their eyes reflecting the pale moonlight like scattered stars. Elena hadn't spoken to him since their argument 2 days ago. She moved through the house like a ghost, preparing meals in silence and retreating to her room whenever he entered a space. The weight of her disappointment hung between them, heavier than the oppressive atmosphere outside. He understood her fear, but she couldn't understand what was happening to him, what had been happening since the moment he'd first set foot on this land. The pull was stronger now, so intense it made his bones ache. It whispered to him in a language older than words, urging him towards something he couldn't yet comprehend. When he closed his eyes, he could see vast networks of energy flowing beneath the earth, connecting every living thing in an intricate web that stretched far beyond the boundaries of the farm. The animals outside weren't just drawn to him. They were part of something larger, something that was awakening after centuries of slumber. Marcus pressed his palm against the cold window glass and watched as a massive elk emerged from the tree line. The creature was enormous, its antlers spanning wider than any he'd seen in nature documentaries. Behind it came others, deer, bears that should have been hibernating, wolves whose eyes gleamed with an intelligence that seemed almost human. They took their places among the gathered multitude, adding their presence to whatever force was building in the darkness. "This has to stop." Elena's voice came from behind him, barely more than a whisper. He turned to find her standing in the doorway, her face pale and drawn. "Whatever you're doing, whatever you think you're meant to do, it's not natural, it's not right." "I'm not doing anything," Marcus said, though even as the words left his mouth he knew they weren't entirely true. He was making choices, moment by moment, to stay, to listen, to let whatever was happening continue. They come on their own. Do they? She stepped closer, and he could see tears glistening in her eyes. Or are you calling to them, without even realizing it? The way you've been changing, Marcus, you're not the same person who arrived here 3 weeks ago. Sometimes when I look at you, I see something else looking back. Her words cut deeper than he wanted to admit. The changes were undeniable. His senses had sharpened to an almost painful degree. His dreams were filled with visions of ancient forests and forgotten rituals, and sometimes he caught himself understanding the subtle communications passing between the gathered animals, as clearly as if they were speaking aloud. But the alternative, walking away from this place, abandoning whatever was being offered to him, felt like a kind of death. "What if this is why I came here?" he asked. "What if everything that happened before, losing my job, the divorce, ending up in this place during the worst winter in decades, what if it was all leading to this moment? And what if it wasn't?" Elena's voice broke slightly. "What if you're just a man who's been through trauma, who's isolated and desperate for meaning, and you're projecting something onto a situation that's nothing more than unusual animal behavior during extreme weather?" Before he could respond, a sound rose from the gathered animals outside. Not quite howling, not quite singing, but something that seemed to blend the voices of every species into a single harmonious note. The sound vibrated through the walls of the farmhouse, through his bones, settling deep in his chest where his heart began to beat in rhythm with it. Elena gasped and pressed her hands to her ears, but Marcus felt only a profound sense of recognition, as if he were hearing his own name called in a language he'd forgotten he knew. The sound grew stronger, more complex, and through the window he could see the animals beginning to move, not scattering, but arranging themselves in patterns that seemed to follow some ancient design. "It's starting," he said, though he wasn't sure what it was. The knowledge came from somewhere deeper than conscious thought, rising from the same place that understood the animals' strange song. Whatever's been building, whatever they've been waiting for, it's finally starting. The temperature in the room began to drop rapidly, their breath becoming visible in the suddenly frigid air. Outside, the snow was falling faster now, but instead of covering the animals, it seemed to swirl around them, creating spiraling columns of white that reached toward the clouded sky. Elena grabbed his arm, her fingers digging into his flesh through his sweater. "We need to leave, right now, before—" The lights went out, plunging them into darkness, broken only by the ethereal glow emanating from the gathered creatures outside. The storm that had been brewing for 3 days finally broke just before dawn, unleashing a fury that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. Marcus stood at the kitchen window, watching as sheets of snow and ice battered against the glass with supernatural intensity. Behind him, the animals had grown restless, the barn cats pacing in tight circles, the ravens clicking their beaks in agitation, even the usually stoic deer shifting nervously where they lay. Something was coming. He could feel it in the electric tension that made his skin crawl, in the way the wind howled with almost human voices. The connection that had grown stronger each day now thrummed through him like a live wire, carrying whispers of danger from every creature within miles of the farm. Sarah's truck appeared through the white veil just as the sun began its weak climb above the horizon. She fought her way through the wind to reach the porch, her face grim with news he somehow already knew he didn't want to hear. "They're mobilizing," she said without preamble, stamping snow from her boots. "Federal agents, wildlife specialists, some kind of military unit. The governor issued an emergency order last night." Marcus nodded, unsurprised. The sensation of approaching threat had been building like pressure before an earthquake. "How long do we have?" "Hours, maybe less." Sarah's eyes swept over the animals gathered throughout the house. "Marcus, there are thousands of them now. Every creature for 50 miles is either here or heading this way. People are scared, not just confused anymore, but genuinely terrified. There are reports of bears walking through downtown, wolves sleeping on front porches, flocks of birds so large they're blocking out the sun." Through the window, Marcus watched a massive brown bear emerge from the tree line, moving with purpose toward the barn. It should have been hibernating, lost in winter dreams, but instead it had answered the same call that drew all the others. The sight should have alarmed him, but instead he felt only a deep sadness for what was about to be lost. "They think you're some kind of threat," Sarah continued, "that you're using the animals somehow, weaponizing them." "Maybe I am." The words surprised him even as he spoke them. Not intentionally, but maybe that's what this has always been building toward. The connection pulsed stronger, and suddenly he could sense them all. Every heartbeat, every breath, every wild thought flowing through the vast network of consciousness that now centered on this place. Predator and prey alike had set aside their natural roles, drawn together by something older and more fundamental than survival instinct. Sarah moved closer, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "What are you, Marcus? Really?" Before he could answer, the air itself seemed to shimmer, and the animals throughout the house grew perfectly still. In that moment of absolute silence, Marcus felt something shift deep within himself, like a door opening in a place he hadn't known existed. The warmth that had sustained him through the brutal winter suddenly flared brighter, and he understood with crystalline clarity what he had always been, what he was meant to do. "I'm a bridge," he said, the truth flowing through him like water through a broken dam, "between what was and what could be, between the world humans have made and the world that remembers how things used to be." Outside, the storm began to calm, as if responding to his words. Through the lessening snow, shapes continued to emerge from the forest, creatures that had no business being awake or active in such weather, all moving with the same inexorable purpose. A red fox trotted past a coyote without so much as a sideways glance. An owl perched beside a hawk on the fence post, their ancient enmity forgotten. They're not just protecting me, Marcus realized aloud. They're protecting what I represent. The possibility of remembering. Sarah followed his gaze to the gathering masses. Remembering what? How to listen, how to speak the language we've forgotten, how to be part of something larger than ourselves instead of always trying to control it. The sound of helicopters began as a distant thrum, growing steadily louder. Marcus closed his eyes and reached out through the network of connected minds, feeling the vast intelligence that emerged when thousands of individual consciousnesses touched and overlapped. It wasn't his power, it had never been his power. He was simply the focal point for something that had always existed, waiting for someone to remember how to step aside and let it flow. When he opened his eyes, Sarah was staring at him with a mixture of wonder and fear. What happens now? Marcus smiled, feeling strangely peaceful despite the approaching confrontation. Now we find out if humans have forgotten how to listen entirely, or if there's still some part of us that remembers what we used to be before we decided we were separate from everything else. The helicopters were close enough now to rattle the windows, but the animals remained calm, waiting with the infinite patience of the wild for whatever would come next. The storm that had been brewing on the horizon for 3 days finally broke just as Maya reached the tree line. Wind howled through the pines with such ferocity that she had to brace herself against a massive oak to keep from being knocked over. Snow whipped horizontally across her vision, but she pressed forward, following the faint glow that seemed to emanate from deeper in the forest. Behind her, she could hear the desperate calls of the search party led by Sheriff Hartwell. They'd been tracking her for hours, ever since she'd slipped away from the town hall meeting where the council had voted unanimously to bring in federal wildlife experts. The decision had been the final straw. She couldn't let them interfere with what was happening at the farm, not when she was so close to understanding. The glow grew stronger as she pushed through the undergrowth, and soon she could make out its source. Hundreds of animals moving in perfect synchronization through the trees. Deer walked alongside wolves, their natural enmity seemingly forgotten. Ravens perched on the antlers of a massive elk, while field mice scurried fearlessly between the paws of a black bear. All of them were heading in the same direction, toward the farm. Maya joined the strange procession, feeling an odd sense of belonging among these creatures who had abandoned their basic instincts. The snow seemed to part around them, creating a corridor of relative calm in the midst of the blizzard. She realized that the young man, Ethan, he'd finally told her his name, wasn't just drawing the animals to him, he was protecting them, sheltering them from the worst of nature's fury. As they emerged from the forest, a farm came into view, transformed beyond recognition. The old barn glowed with the same soft light she'd been following, and the surrounding fields teemed with life despite the raging storm. Animals of every description had gathered here, creating a living mandala that pulsed with energy. At the center of it all stood Ethan, his arms raised toward the sky, his voice carrying a melody that seemed to resonate in her bones. He was singing in a language she didn't recognize, words that felt ancient and powerful. The animals swayed in rhythm with his voice, and Maya found herself moving with them, drawn into the hypnotic dance. As she got closer, she could see tears streaming down Ethan's face, his expression a mixture of ecstasy and profound sorrow. The song reached a crescendo just as lightning split the sky above them. But instead of the harsh crack of thunder, the sound that followed was harmonious, like a cosmic chord being struck. The light emanating from the barn suddenly flared, and Maya felt something shift in the very fabric of reality around them. Images flashed through her mind, visions of a world where the barrier between human consciousness and the natural world had dissolved. She saw cities overgrown with vegetation, their inhabitants living in harmony with the flora and fauna that had reclaimed the concrete and steel. She saw herself, older and marked by time, teaching children to speak the old language, the one Ethan was using now. But with the visions came understanding, and with understanding came fear. This wasn't just about one man's connection to nature. This was about the fundamental transformation of everything. The old world would have to die for the new one to be born, and not everyone would survive the transition. "Maya!" Sheriff Hartwell's voice cut through the storm as he and his deputies burst from the tree line. Their flashlights swept across the scene, creating harsh shadows that seemed to fracture the perfect harmony of the gathering. Several animals startled and began to scatter, breaking the careful pattern that Ethan had woven. His song faltered, and the light from the barn flickered like a candle in the wind. Pain creased his features as he struggled to maintain the connection. "They don't understand," he gasped, his voice barely audible over the wind. "If I don't complete the ritual now, during the convergence, it may be decades before another opportunity arises." Maya found herself standing at a crossroads, both literal and metaphorical. Behind her, Sheriff Hartwell was calling her name, urging her to step away from what he surely saw as a dangerous situation. In front of her, Ethan extended his hand, his eyes pleading with her to trust him, to trust in something larger than herself. The animals that remained seemed to sense the gravity of the moment. They pressed closer, their bodies forming a protective circle around Ethan and Maya. She could feel their collective heartbeat, could sense their desperate hope for something better than the world that had been steadily destroying their habitats and hunting them to the brink of extinction. The choice before her was simple, yet monumentally complex. Preserve the familiar world with all its flaws, or step into the unknown and help birth something entirely new. The wind seemed to hold its breath as Maya reached out and took Ethan's hand, feeling the ancient power flow through her like electricity through copper wire. The blizzard struck without warning, transforming the world into a howling vortex of white. Elias stood at the farmhouse window, watching the storm swallow the landscape whole, erasing the boundaries between earth and sky. Behind him, the kitchen radiated warmth from the wood-burning stove, but he could feel the ancient cold pressing against the glass like a living thing. "They're coming," he whispered to the empty room. Outside, shapes moved through the storm, not the familiar silhouettes of deer or rabbits seeking shelter, but something else entirely. The Watchers. He had sensed their approach for days, felt their presence like a pressure change before lightning strikes. They moved differently than the animals that had been drawn to his sanctuary, with purpose that felt both ancient and alien. Sarah's truck had disappeared into the storm hours ago, her taillights swallowed by the white wall before she reached the main road. He hoped she would make it to town, hoped Dr. Chen would understand what she told him about the choice that lay ahead. But deep down, Elias knew that by the time the storm passed, everything would be different. The first Watcher emerged from the blizzard like a shadow given form. It stood upright on powerful hind legs, its massive frame covered in silver-white fur that seemed to absorb rather than reflect the storm's fury. Yellow eyes, ancient beyond measure, fixed on the farmhouse with an intelligence that made Elias's breath catch. Not quite wolf, not quite bear, but something that existed in the spaces between known things. More shapes materialized from the storm. A great cat, with the bearing of a mountain lion, but the size of a small horse, its spots shifting like moving constellations across its coat. Birds that defied the howling wind, their wingspans impossibly wide, feathers rippling with colors that hurt to look at directly. And others, creatures that seemed to be carved from living stone and shadow, their forms shifting as if they couldn't quite decide what shape to hold in this world. Elias moved to the door, his hand resting on the cold metal handle, the warmth of the house pressed against his back while the storm's fury waited beyond the threshold. He understood now why his grandmother had never spoken of the Watchers directly, why her stories had always danced around their true nature. They were the guardians of the boundary, the keepers of the choice that every shepherd must eventually make. The door opened at his touch, though he hadn't consciously decided to turn the handle. The wind should have torn it from his grasp, should have filled the kitchen with stinging snow and bitter cold. Instead, a strange calm surrounded him as he stepped onto the porch. The storm continued its rage mere feet away, but in the space around the farmhouse, the air hung still and expectant. The silver-furred watcher approached first, its massive paws making no sound on the snow-covered ground. When it spoke, its voice came from everywhere and nowhere, like the memory of thunder rolling through distant mountains. "Keeper of the old ways," it said, and the words resonated in Elias's bones rather than his ears. "The time of choosing has come. The barriers grow thin, the hungry dark presses close." Elias nodded, surprised by his own calm. "I know, I can feel it." "3 paths lie before you," continued the watcher, while its companions formed a wide circle around the farmhouse. "Return to the world of men, let the gift fade, and live as they live, brief and bright and separate. Or embrace what you are fully, cross the threshold, and tend the wild places as we do, eternal and apart." "You said 3 paths." Elias stepped down from the porch, his bare feet somehow untroubled by the snow. "What's the third?" The great cat padded forward, its constellation spots shifting hypnotically. When it spoke, its voice carried the whisper of wind through autumn leaves. "The dangerous path, the one your grandmother chose in her final moment. Bridge the worlds, stand between human and wild, bearing the cost of connection." "What cost?" The watchers exchanged glances that seemed to carry entire conversations. The stone shadow creatures rumbled like distant avalanches before one answered. "To be the bridge is to never fully belong to either side. To love both worlds while being claimed by neither. To bear the pain of their separation in your own flesh until the end of your days." Elias closed his eyes and felt the weight of the choice settling on his shoulders like his grandmother's old quilt. He thought of Sarah driving through the storm, carrying word of what was happening to those who might listen. He thought of Dr. Chen's careful questions about coexistence. He thought of the animals that had found sanctuary on his land, and the town below that feared what they couldn't understand. When he opened his eyes again, the storm was beginning to slow. Through the thinning snow, he could see lights flickering in the distance, the town preparing for whatever dawn might bring. "I already know my answer," he said softly. The storm that had been building for 3 days finally broke just after dawn, and with it came something Marcus had never witnessed before. The animals didn't flee the howling winds and driving snow. They pressed closer to the farmhouse, forming concentric circles around the property like living shields against the tempest. He stood at the kitchen window, watching a massive grizzly bear settle itself against the barn wall while deer huddled nearby, their natural fear seemingly forgotten. Above them, ravens and eagles shared the same branches, their ancient enmity dissolved in the face of whatever force emanated from this place. "They're protecting something," Elena whispered beside him, her breath fogging the glass. She'd arrived the night before, claiming the dreams had become too intense to ignore. The veterinarian's usually practical demeanor had given way to something approaching awe. Marcus nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure what they were protecting. The sensation he'd been feeling for weeks, that pull towards something vast and unknowable, had intensified until it felt like his bones were tuning forks, vibrating with each gust of wind. The mark on his palm, now clearly visible as an intricate tree symbol, pulsed with warmth that seemed to sync with his heartbeat. "The old-timers in town are saying this is the convergence," Elena continued, her voice barely audible above the storm. "My grandfather used to tell stories about it, but I thought they were just legends. Times when the barrier between the human world and the wild becomes thin enough for something ancient to wake up." Through the window, Marcus saw Dr. Hayes making his way across the yard, leaning heavily into the wind. The elderly man had insisted on coming, despite the weather, bringing with him a leather satchel that looked older than the farmhouse itself. Behind him, walking with surprising steadiness given his age, came Thomas Crowfeather, the tribal elder who'd been watching Marcus with knowing eyes for weeks. They gathered in the living room where Marcus had been sleeping, the space now feeling more like a sanctuary than a simple farmhouse room. The walls seemed to pulse with life, and the temperature remained comfortable despite the fury raging outside. "The animals know," Thomas said without preamble, settling into the wooden chair by the fireplace. "They remember what humans have forgotten. This land has been waiting for someone who could hear its voice again." Dr. Hayes opened his satchel, revealing yellowed documents and what appeared to be fragments of bark covered in carved symbols. "I've spent 40 years researching the previous owners of this property. The Westfields weren't the first to abandon this place suddenly. It happens roughly every 70 years, always during the worst winter storms and always after someone arrives who can—" He gestured toward Marcus. "Who can do what you're doing?" "What exactly am I doing?" Marcus asked, though part of him already knew the answer would change everything. Thomas smiled, the expression both gentle and fierce. "You're becoming what this land needs, a bridge between what was and what could be again. The animals aren't just protecting you, they're protecting the possibility you represent." Outside, the wind reached a crescendo that made the entire house shudder. Through the windows, they could see more animals arriving despite the conditions: wolves, elk, even a small group of bison that had somehow found their way through the blizzard. They formed their protective circles and settled in, as if preparing for a long vigil. "There's a choice coming," Dr. Hayes said, his scientific demeanor cracking to reveal something almost mystical beneath. "The same choice that's been offered before. The easy path is to leave, like all the others did. Let the connection fade, return to the normal world, and pretend this never happened." "And the other path?" Marcus asked, though the mark on his palm was burning now, and he could feel the answer in his bones. "You become what you were meant to be," Thomas replied. "A guardian, a translator between species. Someone who can help heal the wounds that centuries of separation have caused. But it means leaving your old life behind completely." Elena moved closer to the window, watching as a family of foxes curled up near the wolves without fear. "Look at them," she whispered. "When was the last time you saw predator and prey sharing space like that? It's like they're remembering something we taught them to forget." Marcus felt the pull again, stronger than ever, and this time he didn't resist it. The sensation flowed through him like water finding its proper channel, and suddenly he could sense each animal outside, their heartbeats, their ancient patience, their hope that things could be different. The storm raged on, but inside the farmhouse, a different kind of weather was building. Marcus looked at his companions, the veterinarian who'd chosen wonder over skepticism, the scientist who'd discovered truths beyond his textbooks, the elder who'd been waiting decades for this moment. Tomorrow, when the storm passed, he would have to decide who he wanted to become. The first rays of dawn pierced through the dissipating storm clouds as Maya led the small group of townspeople up the winding path to Elias's farm. Word had spread quickly through Haven's End about what had transpired during the blizzard, how the animals had formed a protective circle around the town, how the temperature had somehow stabilized, how children had stopped crying and the elderly had found peace in their sleep. Dr. Sarah Chen walked beside Maya, her medical bag clutched tightly in her gloved hands. Behind them, Thomas the blacksmith carried supplies, while Mrs. Henderson held a basket of fresh bread that somehow seemed insignificant given the circumstances they were walking into. The snow beneath their feet crunched with each step, but it was no longer the bone-deep cold that had plagued them for weeks. "I still don't understand what we witnessed," Dr. Chen murmured, her breath forming small clouds in the morning air. "The way those animals moved, the coordination, it defies everything we know about wildlife behavior." Maya glanced at the ravens perched in the pine trees above them. They followed the group's progress with keen interest, but showed no signs of aggression. Maybe what we know isn't everything there is to know. As they crested the hill, the farm came into view. What they saw stopped them in their tracks. The property was transformed. Where once there had been broken fences and overgrown fields, now there was something that looked almost like a sanctuary. Animals moved freely across the grounds, deer grazing peacefully beside foxes, wolves resting near rabbits, hawks sharing space with sparrows. The barn door stood open, revealing hay that looked fresh and abundant despite the harsh winter. But it was Elias himself who drew their attention most powerfully. He stood in the center of the main field, motionless, with his arms outstretched toward the sky. His dark hair moved gently in a breeze that seemed to touch only him. Around his feet, a perfect circle had been worn into the snow, and within that circle, green grass was visible, actual growing grass in the depths of winter. "Dear God," Mrs. Henderson whispered, nearly dropping her basket. A massive grey wolf approached their group, and Thomas instinctively stepped forward, but Maya raised her hand. The wolf's eyes held an intelligence that was both ancient and gentle. It looked at each of them in turn, then tilted its head toward Elias, as if asking them to follow. They walked across the field in reverent silence. As they drew closer to Elias, Maya could see that his eyes were closed, his face serene. His lips moved soundlessly, as if he were speaking to someone they couldn't see. "Elias?" Maya called softly. His eyes opened slowly, and when they focused on her, she saw something that made her heart skip. His usual warm brown eyes now held flecks of gold that seemed to shift and dance like firelight. "Maya." His voice carried an odd resonance, as if it came from somewhere deep within the earth itself. "You came. The whole town is talking about what happened last night," Dr. Chen said, stepping forward with clinical curiosity overriding her caution. "The temperature readings, the animal behavior, how is any of this possible?" Elias lowered his arms slowly, and as he did, several birds that had been circling overhead settled on his shoulders and forearms. A red cardinal perched near his collarbone, its bright feathers vivid against his dark coat. "The connection was always there," he said, his gaze moving across the assembled group. "Between all living things, most people have forgotten how to listen, how to speak the old language. But the animals remember." Thomas shifted uncomfortably. "What are you saying? That you can talk to them?" "Not talk. Communicate. Feel." Elias extended his hand, and a young deer approached, nuzzling his palm. "Every creature carries the same spark of life. When you remember that, really remember it, the barriers start to dissolve." Mrs. Henderson found her voice. "But how did you learn such a thing? This isn't natural, isn't it?" Elias smiled, and the expression was both sad and infinitely patient. "What's unnatural is the way we've separated ourselves from the world we're part of. What's unnatural is believing that we're above or apart from nature instead of woven into its very fabric." Maya watched as more animals continued to arrive, creatures she'd never seen in these parts, as if they'd traveled from far distances to reach this place. "You saved the town last night. They formed a barrier against the storm. They chose to help," Elias corrected. "I simply asked." Dr. Chen pulled out a small notebook, her scientific mind struggling to process what she was witnessing. The implications of this, if it could be studied, understood, replicated. "Some things aren't meant to be replicated," Elias said gently but firmly. "Some things just are." The wind picked up around them, but it carried warmth instead of cold, and Maya caught the impossible scent of spring flowers on the air. The morning after the revelation came with an eerie stillness that made Marcus's skin crawl. The usual symphony of awakening wildlife, the gentle chirping of sparrows, the distant howl of wolves, the rustle of deer moving through the underbrush, had been replaced by an oppressive silence that seemed to press against his eardrums. He stepped onto the farmhouse porch, his breath forming ghostly clouds in the frigid air, and surveyed the transformed landscape. Where once hundreds of animals had gathered in peaceful congregation, now only scattered remnants remained. A lone fox sat motionless near the barn, its amber eyes fixed on something Marcus couldn't see. 3 ravens perched on the fence posts like dark sentinels, their feathers ruffled against the bitter wind. The vision from the previous night still burned in his memory, images of the ancient pact between his bloodline and the wild. The responsibility that had been thrust upon him without his knowledge or consent. He understood now why the animals had come, why they'd been drawn to this place with such desperate urgency. The old magic was dying, and with it, the delicate balance that had protected both human and animal worlds for millennia. Sarah emerged from the tree line, her face pale with exhaustion. She'd spent the night among the remaining animals, trying to understand their behavior through her veterinary training, but Marcus could see the frustration in her eyes. Science had no answers for what they were witnessing. "They're leaving," she said simply, gesturing toward the forest where shapes moved like shadows between the snow-laden pines. Not all at once, but steadily. The smaller ones went first, the rabbits, the squirrels, most of the birds. The larger predators are holding out, but even they seem restless. Marcus nodded, having expected this. The ancient texts he discovered in his grandmother's hidden study had been clear about the consequences of a broken covenant. Without the ritual renewal that should have taken place on the winter solstice, the protective bonds would begin to unravel, leaving the wildlife vulnerable to forces that had been held in check for generations. "There's something else," Sarah continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "I found tracks this morning, something big moving in a perfect circle around the property. The spacing is wrong, though, too wide for any natural gate I know." A chill ran down Marcus's spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. He'd read about the hunters in his grandmother's journal, ancient entities that existed in the spaces between the human and natural worlds, feeding on the life force of creatures caught without protection. They were drawn to disrupted magic like vultures to carrion. "Show me," he said. They trudged through the knee-deep snow toward the eastern edge of the property, where Sarah pointed out the tracks. Marcus knelt beside them, running his fingers along the impressions. They were larger than anything that should exist in these woods, with claw marks that suggested something both predatory and utterly alien. Worse, the snow around each print had taken on a grayish tint, as if the very life had been drained from it. "How long do we have?" Sarah asked. Marcus stood, brushing snow from his knees. "Not long. Maybe hours, maybe less. The barriers are failing faster than I expected." He'd spent most of the night studying his grandmother's notes, trying to understand the ritual that could renew the ancient pact. The process was complex, requiring not just knowledge of the old words and symbols, but a willing sacrifice of something precious. The text spoke of blood, of binding one's life force to the land itself, of becoming a conduit between worlds. "There might be a way," he said carefully, watching Sarah's reaction. "But it's dangerous. And if it goes wrong, tell me." He explained what he'd learned, watching her face grow increasingly troubled as he described the ritual requirements. The ceremony would need to be performed at the exact center of the property where the old oak stood, the same tree where he'd first felt the pull of the ancient magic. It would require his blood, yes, but more than that. It would require him to open himself completely to the wild consciousness, to let it flow through him until the boundary between Marcus and the natural world dissolved entirely. "You're talking about possession," Sarah said flatly. "I'm talking about partnership," he corrected, though he wasn't entirely sure there was a difference. "My ancestors did this for centuries. They were the bridge between worlds, the guardians who kept the balance." A howl echoed from the forest, long and mournful, followed by another from a different direction. The wolves were calling to each other, and in their voices Marcus heard both farewell and warning. Time was running out. Sarah grabbed his arm. "What if you don't come back? What if whatever consciousness you let in decides to stay?" Marcus looked at her, then at the remaining animals who watched them with ancient, knowing eyes. "Then at least they'll be safe." The decision crystallized in that moment, inevitable as winter itself. The aurora danced overhead as Marcus stood at the threshold between two worlds, his bare feet planted firmly on the boundary line where ancient stones met winter earth. The assembled creatures, wolves, ravens, deer, and countless others, formed concentric circles around him, their eyes reflecting the ethereal green light that now seemed to emanate from his very being. Sarah watched from the farmhouse porch, her breath forming crystalline clouds in the frigid air. She had followed Marcus here 3 months ago, drawn by rumors of the strange young man who could speak to animals. Now she understood she had witnessed something far more profound than mere communication. This was communion of the oldest kind. The temperature plummeted further, yet Marcus showed no sign of cold. His skin had taken on an otherworldly luminescence, and when he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that seemed to resonate through the very bones of the earth. "The old compact was broken long ago," he said, addressing not just the animals but something far greater, the living essence of the land itself. "When your kind forgot that we were never meant to be separate, the balance began to fail." A massive wolf, larger than any Sarah had ever seen, padded forward from the inner circle. Its fur was silver-white, and ancient wisdom gleamed in its amber eyes. As it approached Marcus, she realized this was no ordinary animal but something primal, perhaps the very spirit of wilderness itself. The wolf spoke, not in words but in images that somehow reached Sarah's mind across the distance. She saw forests stretching endlessly under pristine skies, rivers running clear and cold, and humans living in harmony with the natural world, taking only what was needed, giving back more than they consumed. Then came darker visions, forests burning, rivers poisoned, the delicate web of life stretched to its breaking point, the earth itself crying out in anguish as the connection between human consciousness and natural wisdom was severed, generation by generation, until most had forgotten it ever existed. Marcus nodded gravely. "I remember," he whispered, "and I have come to restore what was lost." He raised his hands, and the aurora above them intensified, casting everything in shades of emerald and silver. The ancient stones began to hum with resonant frequency, their carved symbols glowing with the same ethereal light that surrounded Marcus. Sarah felt something shift inside her chest, a recognition so deep it seemed to bypass her conscious mind entirely. She had always felt disconnected from the modern world, drawn to wild places and the company of animals over humans. Now she understood why. She carried the same spark that blazed so brilliantly in Marcus, though hers had been nearly extinguished by years of forgetting. The creatures began to move, not randomly but in patterns that spoke of intelligence far older than human civilization. Birds took to the air, their formations creating living mandalas against the star-filled sky. Mammals arranged themselves in spirals that echoed the golden ratio, while smaller creatures, field mice, rabbits, even insects that should have been dormant in winter's grip, added their voices to a symphony beyond human hearing. Marcus stepped fully onto the stone circle, and the very air seemed to ignite around him. He was changing, becoming something between human and elemental force. His eyes held the depth of forest shadows and the brightness of mountain streams. When he moved, it was with the fluid grace of wind through trees and the solid certainty of stone. "The awakening begins here," he said, and his voice carried for miles on the winter wind. "But it will spread. Those who remember will teach others to remember. The old ways will return, not to replace what has been built, but to restore the balance that was lost." Sarah found herself walking forward, drawn by an impulse stronger than fear or rational thought. With each step, the frozen ground seemed to warm beneath her feet. The assembled animals parted to create a path, and she realized they had been waiting for her as much as they had gathered for Marcus. As she entered the circle, memories that were not her own flooded her consciousness. She saw herself in other times, other lives, always serving as a bridge between the human and natural worlds. She was a keeper of the old knowledge, a guardian of the ancient compact, reborn in each generation when the need was greatest. Marcus extended his hand to her, and when their fingers touched, the aurora exploded into brilliant cascades of light that could be seen for hundreds of miles. In that moment, every person sensitive to the deeper currents of existence felt the change beginning, a great awakening that would ripple outward from this small farm, this forgotten corner of the world where magic still lived. The animals began to sing then, each species adding its voice to a harmony that had not been heard on Earth for millennia. It was the sound of healing beginning, of balance being restored, of humanity remembering its true place in the vast web of existence. The transformation was no longer coming, it had begun. The morning sun cast long shadows across the snow-covered fields as Ezra stood at the edge of what had once been the abandoned farm. Behind him, the ancient oak that had become the heart of everything stretched its massive branches toward the sky, its roots now visibly pulsing with veins of golden light that ran like rivers through the earth. Sarah approached from the farmhouse, her breath forming small clouds in the crisp air. Over the past weeks, she had watched the impossible transformation unfold, barren land blooming even in winter's grip, animals gathering in unprecedented harmony, and Ezra himself changing into something that defied every natural law she thought she understood. "The delegation from the capital arrives today," she said, her voice carrying both anticipation and concern. "Are you ready for this?" Ezra turned to face her, and she saw in his eyes the same depth that had first drawn the ravens, then the deer, then countless other creatures to this place. But now, there was something more, a weight of responsibility that seemed to bend the very air around him. "I've been ready my whole life," he replied, though his expression suggested the gravity of what lay ahead. "The question is whether they're ready for the truth." As if summoned by his words, a convoy of black vehicles appeared on the distant road, kicking up clouds of snow and disturbing the profound quiet that had settled over the land. The animals sensed the approaching intrusion immediately. Hundreds of crows rose from the trees in a synchronized spiral, while wolves emerged from the forest to form a protective circle around the property's perimeter. Sarah felt her heart race as the vehicles drew closer. What if they try to stop you? What if they don't understand? Ezra placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, and she felt an immediate calm wash over her. Not magical coercion, but something deeper, like the peace one finds beside a mountain stream or in the heart of an old forest. "Then I'll show them what I showed you," he said simply. The convoy came to a halt at the farm's entrance, and men in expensive coats emerged, their faces grim with official authority. At their head walked a woman with silver hair and calculating eyes, Minister Rebecca Hawthorne, whose reputation for dismantling environmental protections preceded her like a storm front. Behind them came the scientists, skeptics armed with instruments and theories, and finally the journalists, their cameras already rolling to capture whatever spectacle awaited. Minister Hawthorne approached with the confidence of someone accustomed to being the most powerful person in any room. But as her feet touched the soil of Ezra's land, something shifted. The golden veins beneath the earth pulsed brighter, and every animal present turned to look directly at her. "Mr. Thorne," she began, her voice clipped and professional, "you've caused quite a stir with your activities here. We've come to assess whether your presence poses any threat to public safety or ecological stability." Ezra smiled, expression both sad and infinitely patient. "Minister Hawthorne, what I'm about to show you will challenge every assumption your government has made about humanity's relationship with the natural world, but I ask only that you observe with an open mind." Without waiting for permission, he walked to the great oak and placed both palms against its bark. The response was immediate and breathtaking. The golden veins beneath the ground blazed to life, creating a network of light that stretched beyond the horizon. The tree itself began to sing, not with any voice the humans could hear, but with a resonance that made their bones vibrate and their hearts race. Every animal for miles responded to the call. Birds darkened the sky as they converged overhead, their wings creating patterns of shadow and light. Wolves, bears, deer, and countless smaller creatures emerged from forest and field to surround the gathering, their eyes reflecting an intelligence that seemed ancient and profound. But it was the earth itself that provided the most stunning revelation. Where Ezra's hands touched the oak, the snow began to melt in perfect spirals, revealing beneath it not the brown stubble of winter, but grass so green it seemed to glow, flowers that bloomed in defiance of season, and young trees pushing up from soil that moments before had been frozen solid. Minister Hawthorne staggered backward, her composure finally cracking. "This is impossible. This violates every law of nature, every scientific principle we understand." "No," Ezra replied, his voice now carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate with the wind itself. "This ice the law of nature. the one your civilization has forgotten, the one your ancestors knew by heart. He released his connection to the tree and faced the assembled officials, scientists, and journalists. Around them, the animals maintained their vigil, neither threatening nor retreating. "I am what humans were meant to become," Ezra announced, his words carrying across the winter landscape with impossible clarity. "Not masters of nature, but partners with it. Not separate from the web of life, but consciously woven into it. And I'm here to offer that partnership to anyone ready to remember what we've lost." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the wind through branches and the distant call of wild geese overhead.